Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's our pleasure to have Professor Kanti Prasad Bajpai. He's a Wilmer Professor of Asian Studies, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore since 2014. He's also the director, Center on Asia and Globalization of the same School of Public Policy, NUS, since 2017. Now, before coming to LKY School, he was Professor of International Politics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Professor in the Politics and International Relations, South Asia, Oxford University from 2003 to 9. He was a headmaster at the Doon School, India as well. He taught at the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda and has held visiting appointments at several universities, including Wesleyan University, Columbia University, and the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He has also Foundation, John B. Crock Institute for Peace, Notre Dame University, the Brookings Institution, and the Australian Defence Force Academy. Most recently, he was also Distinguished Fellow of Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. Professor Bajpai writes a regular column for the Times of India. Professor Bajpai's interests include international security, India's foreign policy, and national security. He has produced numerous celebrated works such as India in the World, Trials of the Republic, Roots of Terrorism, and other works in India's foreign policy and national security. I'm sure this is what he shared with me. He has just completed a book on India-China relations, which he was working, due to which we had a little delay in terms of his lecture, which we were expected in the last semester. Professor Bajpai, this is a Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. It's been a decade-old one, and we have master's program and then also a PhD program. And Manipal Academy of Higher Education has been extremely supportive of this particular program to bring geopolitics into the realm, because elsewhere in India, geopolitics is not taught as such. So geopolitics and international has been our core area in terms of national security, looking at India's foreign policy and a few other important components. So it's our pleasure and indeed honor to have you this morning to deliver a lecture on a very, very important theme, which is of great interest to our students. This semester, they're studying India's worldview. They're also doing India's foreign policy. So it's directly related to the subject that they're studying. Thank you, and over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and of course for the invitation to address you and others, including, of course, primarily the students. Just a couple of corrections. I've been at the LKY school since 2011, not 2014, and I was at the Doon School from 03 to 09, not at JNU in Oxford. But other than that, I think pretty accurate in depicting me. But thanks again for inviting me to do this, and for pushing me to think a little bit about some work that I've done since really since 2000 or so. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. We agreed on a title, Revisiting Discourse on India's Strategic Culture and Grand Strategy. And I've tried to give expression to that. I won't say a great deal about geopolitics per se, although, you know, geopolitics clearly informs much of security thinking. And so if I'm going to talk about strategic culture and grand strategy, I don't think there's any getting away from geopolitics. If we understand geopolitics to mean the role of location, geography on one's attitude towards security in other countries, and the opportunities and the constraints that come from that. So, of course, I shan't address that issue very directly, but clearly, if you ask the question, where does strategic culture come from? Then you can see that it comes from history and geography in quite large part. And in a course that I teach, which I'm teaching right now to my master's students, and the course is called Asian International and Strategic Thought, every week they watch videos on the 8 countries that we study, which give them an overview of that country's history and its geography. So in that sense, you know, I mean, I think I'm in the kind of space that you've indicated by invoking the term geopolitics. Okay, so what do I want to do in this talk? I really want to do something fairly academic. I'm not really here to talk policy, although I do that kind of work. And my most recent book, India versus China, Why They Are Not Friends, does have some policy implications. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about that book. But of course, I do that in my work. But I'm really trying to get at in this talk is, what are Indian strategic culture studies? What's the state of play? How does strategic culture relate to the problem of grand strategy? And just at the end, to talk a little bit about what might be the uses of strategic culture studies and its future. So that's broadly what I'm going to try and address in this talk. It's quite academic, but then your students are all academic here. I'm not talking mostly to policymakers, I assume. And so I wanted to fit into the kind of academic world that they inhabit at the moment, which is struggling with ideas of, kind of conceptualization, theory, methodology, those kinds of issues. Okay, so let me begin. I think if we ask the question, when did Indian strategic culture studies begin? I guess 1992 is probably the year that everyone will point to. That's the year that an American from the Rand Institution in America, George Tanham, wrote a couple of pieces, one a small monograph for Rand, and also a small article, a much smaller article, that appeared in the Washington Quarterly, if I remember, where Tanham argued, this is 1992, just after the Cold War, that as interest turned towards India in this post-Cold War period, it was striking to him that India did not seem to have much of a strategic culture. It didn't seem to be rich in strategic thinking. And one could not necessarily describe a kind of dominant set of precepts, ideas, principles, logics, lines of thinking that were particular to India. Now, he didn't dismiss Indian thinking altogether, but he didn't see a lot of it. He didn't think it was systematic. And people like K. Subramaniam, the great Indian thinker, and many others in the strategic community around India endorsed his point of view, saying that he had said what they'd been saying for a long time, that India didn't seem to have a strategic culture. Indeed, some said India didn't seem to have strategy. It was just all over the place. It was reactive. It didn't seem to have a plan of its own to maximize its security. But then, of course, since then, a lot of writing has appeared that challenged that view. And indeed, I worked with Tanham and Amit Amattu to publish his original essay, and then a second essay by Tanham, and then some critical responses to him. And in that second essay, Tanham himself seemed to somewhat change his view, perhaps under criticism or pressure from Indians and others who had reacted to his first essay. But in fact, if you trace the history of strategic culture studies, Tanham is not the originator, although his monograph and article are seen as kind of the tipping point. In fact, a man called Joel Laris, who's not an Indian specialist, had written as early as 1979 an essay called Culture and Military Behavior Amongst Ancient Hindus, and there's a longer subtitle. But essentially, he was trying to trace through a classical Indian, that is Hindu thought in particular, and trying to talk about the relationship to military behavior. I mean, exactly in a sense what this talk is about today. And Stephen P. Cohen, my supervisor at Illinois, who I did my PhD under, a year later wrote a piece that everyone has forgotten, but which I remember very well, and some others do, which he titled The Strategic Imagery of Indian and Pakistani Elites. And there he tried to sketch in a portrait of both Indian strategic imagery or thinking and Pakistani. And the piece then tried to say, well, if this is how the two elites think, can this account for why they can't cooperate on stuff, why they don't agree for things? That's 1979-80. That's more than a decade before Tanham arrived on the scene. So I think, just to set the record straight, Tanham was the tipping point, but there were people working in this area now and then, like Laris, Cohen, and indeed, I'm sure think tanks and diplomats were writing all kinds of notes that we don't have access to that tried to get at these kinds of issues. for India. I think after Tanam, I would say the time of 2000 to 2002 was probably the real start of then what has been a whole series of writings on strategic culture in India and grand strategy. More strategic culture, less grand strategy, but both topics have kind of, found expression in writings more since about that time. So Steve Cohen wrote a book on India Emerging Power. He was now at the Brookings Institution, and I remember I was there at that time and looking at drafts of his book, where he suggested that there were 3 or 4 different strategic schools in India. I had written a piece independently of him, as it turns out, a little earlier, which was also published in 2000, maybe a year before Cohen's book came out, not directly on strategic culture broadly, but on different schools of nuclear thinking, where I was trying to sort out, after India's 1998 nuclear tests, the different schools of thought in India on nuclear weapons. And that was published in JNU's journal, International Studies, in 2000. I think it was written actually late 1998 or early 1999, but by the time it went to press, it was 2000. And Rajesh Basrur, who was a colleague across town here in Singapore, also in 1980-81, wrote a piece on India's nuclear strategic culture. And his piece is somewhat overlaps with mine, but is somewhat different as well. Bharat Karnad wrote his huge book, which you probably cannot quite see. It's just in the bookshelf behind me, on India's nuclear program, a book enormously fat, that big, 600-700 pages. But the most interesting part of that book to me, and it's a very lively book, is a huge chapter that he devotes to ancient Indian, that is Hindu and somewhat Buddhist thinking, and all the way up to Gandhi, thinking about the problem of violence, of war, just war, weapons of mass destruction. And he teases out very nicely, classical Hindu writings, and takes the story right up to, jumps hundreds of years and then goes to Gandhi and his attitude. So I think around 2000, 2002, these 3 or 4 pieces appeared, and they all began to focus on what are some broad lines of thinking, styles of thought, approaches, whatever you want to call it, on topics related to India's strategy, its security. Okay, so it's been 30 years from Tanam's original monograph, 40 years since Joel Laris and Cohen first wrote, and 20 years since, I think, the Cohen, Karnad, Basrur, and Bajpai pieces were written, that I think really then set things in motion. Forgive me for being a bit immodest in mentioning my name there, but I think that my piece was one of those that did play a role in galvanizing what has come to be now quite a substantial body of work on the subject. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is that, just with that little historical background, I'm going to sort of take stock of this whole area and suggest that there are challenges related to the concept of strategic culture, to the concept of grand strategy, and particularly to the link between strategic culture and grand strategy. So one view would be that strategic culture explains grand strategy. Our strategic thought, the broad principles we have, the ideas and logics we hold to in our thinking, that affects what we actually do, the strategy, the plan, the implementation that governments do to make us secure. And of course, that would be the great kind of reward to thinkers, which is that their ideas somehow do affect policy. But the question is whether that's the case, and can we tease out anything like that in the Indian case? It's quite problematic, is my answer, but we probably shouldn't stop trying. So let me begin with a review of what is strategic culture. You may have already in your classes begun with thinking about these issues, but I'll just do a quick review. One way of talking about strategic culture, in a sense, is to go through 3 waves of strategic culture studies. I think this is quite familiar. It's been summarized by people like Alistair Ian Johnson, the Harvard political scientist who wrote on Chinese strategic culture. But the first wave was sort of after World War II. These were macro studies, sort of national character studies. What are the Japanese like, and what is their military style? Ruth Benedict wrote The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, a very famous kind of book, an anthropologist. There were national character studies of The American Way of War by Russell Weigley, or, the British style of war, relating these to some really deep structural characteristics of a people. Of course, this received a lot of criticism because the people said this was very essentialist. What was basic American national character? Who knew? What was the deepest sort of cultural and other principles of the Japanese or the Chinese or the Russians or the Indians or the Americans? Who knew? Could one boil it all down to some very simple principles? It was very essentialist, is the basic criticism that did the rounds. Then there was a second wave during the Cold War, particularly in America, which tried to derive strategic culture, the broad precepts and principles and lines of thinking, from practice. So American political scientists studied Soviet behavior, or Chinese behavior, but mostly Soviet behavior during the height of the Cold War. And from that, they abstracted certain kinds of basic principles. If this is what the Soviets did at various times and places, one could see a pattern. And from that pattern, if it was, continuous over many kinds of episodes, then one could say, well, okay, this is what Soviet strategic culture is. But along came Alistair N. Johnson in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and he said, this is problematic because what you do if you do that is your reasoning becomes circular. You derive principles and precepts from practice, from looking at actual behavior, and then you take the principles and precepts that you have derived from practice and say, oh, this will explain practice, future practice. So, it becomes circular, tautological. And so Johnson sought to try and rescue strategic culture studies from the second wave of deriving principles and precepts of strategic culture from practice. And he said, no, what you need to do is go to some canonical texts, that is, some texts that have the status of, acceptance in a society, which makes them canonical, meaning that they are so important that everyone accepts that they are really very well known, they've been historically influential, and people are very familiar with them. And he picked, as you know, in his famous book, Cultural Realism on China, he picked the 7 military classics from China as the symbol of, or the singular most important text from which you could derive strategic culture. And he deeply analyzed it and pulled out all these kinds of principles. And then he looked at whether those principles actually explain Chinese behavior in antiquity, in Maoist times, and after the Cold War. And he said, yes, it does. So that's, I think, largely where the strategic culture debate has ended up. I mean, there are some variations and criticisms of Johnson in turn, and so forth, which is quite understandable. And now we have Bloomfield and others talking about, let's break down strategic culture into subcultures. So the military has military culture, and perhaps the foreign ministries have a diplomatic culture, and your political leaders have a more political sort of culture and appreciation, etc. So some of what's happening is that kind of, but in general, I think the critique of Johnson was that, again, he seemed to insist on a singular culture. He wanted to derive one dominant culture, that strategic culture in a country. And Bloomfield and others have said, well, we see contending strategic cultures at any given time. And in fact, this is exactly what happened in 2000, 2002 in India on Indian strategic culture, where Cohen, myself, Rajesh Basrur, to some extent, Bharat Karnad, saw at least 3 or 4 schools of strategic thinking, not one singular dominant school. So in a sense, we were there before, I think, some of the changes that have occurred in strategic culture studies since then in the West. Okay, so the other, I think, criticism that I particularly had, but others may have had of Johnson as well, is that his strategic culture thinking really focused on, on strategy. That is, how do the Chinese think about the application of force? Whereas you must be familiar with the term that's in the title of this talk, which is grand strategy. And grand strategy is the pulling together of all of a country's resources, military to be sure, but also diplomatic, perhaps cultural, economic, and even political, for the purposes of security. And different countries have a different mix of these various resources that they apply to the problem of security. But in Johnson, he focuses just really on whether China has a strategic culture, which he called parabellum, which is oriented towards the offensive, preemptive use of force. But in my work, in Steve Cohen's work, in Rajesh's work, well, Rajesh's work was on nuclear weapons, so it is closer to the issue of military culture. But for Steve and me particularly, we open it up into grand strategy. What is the broad mix of resources that a country would use towards the purposes of security? And so that's, I think, where, in a sense, strategic culture studies in India, or the Indian case, went. Plural, focused on grand strategy as much as the application of force. So I think that's remained the case, but I'll come to that in a minute. Okay, so what is grand strategy? I've just said something about it. I mean, the history of the term, it goes back at least to the British strategist Basil Liddell-Hart. Others have traced it back much further. And there's been a huge amount of work on grand strategy, mostly in the case of America. But there was a lot of resistance to this term being used in India. I remember, perhaps I was one of the first to use it in some seminar somewhere in Delhi in the late 90s, and it caused the audience to burst out laughing. It's quite a humorous moment, but essentially they said, well, India doesn't have grand strategy. It may not even have strategy at all, because everything in India is ad hoc and reactive, and so there's no grand plan. So I was kind of shouted down and told that stop importing these Western ideas. There's no such thing as grand strategy, and you're wasting time. But in fact, you can take that point of view, but in fact, if a concept has utility, someone will pick it up. And Admiral Raja Menon and Dr. Rajiv Kumar, an economist, in the 2000s, they wrote a couple of books with the term grand strategy in it. And I co-edited a volume a little bit later when I was at IDSA, which also has the term grand strategy in it, an edited volume. So the term is now, I think, increasingly popular in India and well recognized, although sometimes it's still mixed up with just strategy, but that's understandable. What's worth saying, I think, and it points to a problem for the future, is that grand strategy includes the problem of internal security, because internal security must impact external security concerns, and they do. I think we all have an intuition that that's so, and many studies will show that all across the world. In India, what does internal security mean? Largely, it means the problem of managing social diversity. Language groups, caste groups, tribal groups, religious groups, regional differences, and even class differentiation. I mean, these groups have become political. They make demands on the system. At the extreme, some groups threaten to secede and separate from the country. That gives rise to insurgencies and counterinsurgency and all of that. There's an externalized element to it. either Pakistan or China or someone might begin to aid some of these groups, particularly those that are at India's borderlands. And so this is where internal security meets external security. But internal security also meets external security, because if you're preoccupied with internal stability, it's hard to know how you will deal with external threats, in an effective way. And so all countries worry about the internal. But the problem, I think, in Indian grand strategic studies, just to jump ahead of the story a little bit, is that there isn't much thought given to the internal security part of it, except when dealing with something like terrorism or insurgency, where there's an external backer, perhaps, or an external country becomes a place of refuge for insurgents. But the larger problem of India's social diversity and how it affects grand strategy, I think that really is not dealt with much. In my original article, where I dealt with schools of strategic thinking, I did point to it. And I went so far as to say that the different schools of thought on grand strategy find their roots in political ideology. And so that's a sensitive area. And I think one of the reasons that people don't want to in India that deal with grand strategy don't want to deal with internal security much is because they fear being political. I mean, whether you're for caste reservations as a way of dealing with diversity or not has become a very politicized issue. Whether you are for this language policy or that language policy has also become very political or politicized. So I think people who do IR and foreign policy studies and strategy stay away from it because they don't want to get into trouble. And I think that's increasingly the problem in today's India, that there's fear of either the government or being trolled or attacked by groups in civil society. Anyway, it is a gap. And I don't think you can really talk about grand strategy sensibly without paying attention to the internal determinants and the internal part of grand strategy. All right, but anyway, let's move on to writings on Indian strategic culture and grand strategy. There's a huge literature there. Originally, I was going to present some slides to you, but from about 2000, 2002, it really takes off. People like, I can't pronounce his name, his German name, Roger Bursky, I think, wrote on Kautilya. Manjit Pardesi has worked on, ancient and medieval India and its grand strategy. Jones wrote on, ancient Indian strategic culture. Likewise, Zaman, Rahul Sagar at NYU wrote a nice essay in my book, Jiski Lathi Uski Bhains, pointing to, Indian conservative Hindu nationalist thinking. And earlier he had a piece on, rather similar to mine, going back to about 2009, on 4 schools of strategic thought in India. Toby Engelmeyer characterized Indian foreign policy thinking in different ways. Pratap Mehta has an essay in 2009. Harsh Pant took stock of the whole strategic culture debate in 2011. Vipin Narang at MIT and Paul Staniland at Chicago wrote on ideas and practice in Indian foreign policy in 2012. Deepa Olapalli and Rajesh Rajgopalan in 2012 wrote about 6 schools of Indian strategic thought. Pradeep Gautam at IDSA has done a lot to animate Kautilya studies. IDSA produced these studies on Kautilya and has done a lot to popularize thinking about Kautilya. Deep Datta Ray wrote a book on kind of deconstructing Indian foreign policy thinking and its Eurocentricism. Swarna Rajgopalan, again in a volume I edited, went back to the epics, to the Mahabharata, to show that there was all kinds of interesting thoughts and ideas there about war making and so forth. Shrikant Paranjpe in Pune has written a whole book on Indian strategic culture. Liebig and Mitra wrote on Kautilya and so forth. Beitelmeyer and Berini have written a kind of stock taking again of strategic culture in 2017. And just to finish, just to give you an idea, to show that it's lively and this body of work is growing. And if you haven't encountered it, these are some names. But I'm just finishing a piece for a volume in honor of Bharat Karnad at CPR, who's retiring, where I look at 3 schools of realism in India. And that'll be coming out next year. It's in an edited volume that I'm just finishing for Bharat. And a former student of mine, Kajri Kamal, has just finished a book on looking at Kautilya and Indian strategic culture. And Professor Bisht at South Asia University likewise has written an entire book on Kautilya and the Arthashastra. So, I mean, how to sum up this? I think there are three strands of Indian strategic culture studies. There's those who've written about classical and ancient texts. And here there's there's sort of three lines of thinking, I think. The first is Kautilya studies. The very tough-minded, cold-eyed view of Kautilya in the Arthashastra, Mandala theory, but also his work on internal security and statecraft. So that's one line of thinking. The other is the growing attention being paid to Ashoka. Now, interestingly, they're of the same time, but the Ashokan strategic culture is seen to be almost the antithesis of Kautilya. Kautilya was supposedly, if one can really locate him historically clearly enough, the advisor to Ashoka's grandfather. Ashoka, coming later, converts to Buddhism and adopts a very different sort of strategic culture and grand strategy. And people like the historian Nayanjot Lahiri at Ashoka University, as it happens, but also this fabulous book on political violence. And I'm just looking across at my bookshelf because this is by Professor Manmohan Singh, Dr. Manmohan Singh's daughter, the historian, has written a huge volume on political violence in ancient India. And that deals also with the Ashokan, but also the Kautilyan. Interestingly, I mean, within a very short space of time, you have two quite different views on grand strategy, from Kautilya at one side, Ashoka on the other. And then, of course, the third more classical source, which again is in the book Political Violence, are the epics, the Mahabharata, the Gita, the Ramayana, as a source of strategic thinking. Now, I don't know those texts well enough to say much about them, but clearly one brand of study is the classical and ancient period in India. A second strand, much less written about, but which is emerging, it seems to me, is medieval and British India. And so here the two great, I guess, moments or purveyors of grand strategic thought and culture and grand strategy are the Mughals, and then particularly Lord Curzon of the British period. Now, after the ancient period, we have an enormous span of Indian history, but attention has really focused after the ancient period on the Mughals. And so a former student of mine, Jayashree Vivekanandan, began a PhD with me before I left to become headmaster of my old school on the grand strategy of the Mughals, and she focused on Akbar in particular and finished her thesis under Professor Swaran Singh, and it's a book. Likewise, Manjeet Pardesi in New Zealand has written about Mughal grand strategy and that period, kind of medieval India. And there are historians who here and there, without using the language of grand strategy, have addressed how the Mughals managed their relationship with empires at the margins, the Persians, the Afghans, to some extent perhaps the Chinese, although we don't know much about the relationship to the Chinese, perhaps the Burmans, but also to the regional kingdoms that they didn't conquer in India. Certain Rajput kingdoms, southern kingdoms, eastern kingdoms that they never quite brought under direct control. What was the relationship between, how did they deal with them? Sometimes through marriage and alliances, sometimes through war making, sometimes through economic instruments, sometimes through, with Akbar, trying to propagate a new religion, Deen-e-Ilahi, trying to get valuational buy-in on the part of others to regulate the relationship between the empire and the regional kingdoms through a buy-in to a sort of worldview. If we move forward to the British period, there are probably quite a number of rather interesting governors general and British thinkers in British India, but a lot of attention is focused on Curzon of the late 19th century, early 20th. And I suppose C. Rajamohan, my colleague here in Singapore, has been the one who's written most actively about the Curzonian influence on Indian grand strategy and strategic thinking. And in a word, this is the view that Curzon had, apparently, that India, he was referring to South Asia, what we know South Asia now, was one strategic whole. And that its unity as a strategic entity gave rise to certain kinds of lines of thinking. The Russians at that time, pre the Soviet Revolution, should not be allowed to enter South Asia. The Chinese should be held at bay also through buffers like Tibet. On the other side, the Persian Empire likewise should be held at bay, etc., etc. And in much of his vision seemed to be of the land boundaries, but I suppose I don't know enough about Curzon to say, but I think he also had a vision of kind of dominance of the Indian Ocean. So that speaks to this kind of modern Indian view post-independence, that India ought to be the real centerpiece and dominant force in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean zone. And somebody like K.M. Panikkar, the geopolitical thinker, diplomat, and historian, kind of broadly, represented an Indian Curzonian view, writing in the 1940s and 50s on the Indian Ocean and so forth. So that's a second strand. So you're the classical, ancient, the medieval and British, and then of course there's modern post-independence thought. The leaders of India, Nehru and so on, strategists out there in think tanks and in the media, and of course academics who contributed to strategic thought. So let's take stock of these very briefly. Time is going and I want there to be enough time for Q&A and comments. If you look at the classical medievalist work, I think there's several difficulties that confront anyone trying to work in this area. If you want to go back to those times, the first problem is linguistic difficulties. How many of us have enough of a command over classical languages, Sanskrit, Persian for the medieval period, the Mughals and so on, and perhaps even other regional languages native to India that may have produced works that would qualify as being relevant, at least, to strategic thinking? I mean, is it plausible that the great kingdoms and empires in southern India, eastern India, western India, such as the Marathas and so on, did not have any writings, in their own languages? Frankly, I just don't know. I assume that that's the case, but in any case, even if you're dealing with the great classical texts of India, ultimately you should know Sanskrit to be able to go to the original source and not rely on however brilliant the English translations may be. And so that's, I think, one very big problem of going back to the earlier texts. The other is the kind of standard interpretive difficulty. Even if you knew Sanskrit, how do you interpret a text that was written 2,000 years ago, or even earlier, or 500 years ago, or even 150 years ago? Those who do hermeneutics, the science or art of interpretation, know how difficult it is to interpret text. And you have to relate it to context, that is the larger historical, cultural milieu of the times. You have to kind of get a sense of what the author may have intended or not intended. You have to deal with something called intertextuality, which is often these texts were written, kind of as a tacit, if not explicit, rejoinder or as part of a larger debate that was existing. It was so to really understand it, you have to understand what it was arguing against, or who it was arguing against at the time. To what extent, take a Western example, when Locke writes about the social contract, how much was he in dialogue with an earlier great thinker, which is Thomas Hobbes? You can't really understand what Locke is trying to say, or Rousseau, if you don't understand what Hobbes was saying and how they were trying to mark off a different point of view. So there's that kind of problem of interpretation. The third is, which are the key texts? So I think we can all agree on some classical texts, obviously, that we are all agreed upon. But I mean, let's remember, for instance, take the Arthashastra. I mean, today we take it as a canonical text, a fundamental text. But it was only rediscovered in the 1920s by Ramashama Shastri. It had been lost since probably about the period of the Guptas. Nobody knew about it. Or at best, they kind of vaguely heard about it, it seems, and some of its ideas and so on may have seeped into thought and practice, but we didn't actually have the text. So, what are the other lost texts that we have still not found? So if you want to go back in time and give a very full and rich picture of the texts that have given rise to our history and our thought, then which are the key texts? Which are the ones that are lost? Are we overemphasizing Kautilya just because it's been found? And we know there's another tradition, even at the very moment that Kautilya was talking about his view of statecraft, there was the Ashokan. There's intertextuality right there. Those who were at that time were practicing, thinking, Buddhist-inspired Ashokan thinking, could not have been unaware of some elements, obviously, of Kautilya at that time. So there's the problem of which are the grand texts of the past, apart from the ones that we're all agreed on, the Mahabharata, the Gita, the Ramayana and so forth. But beyond that, was there a larger set of texts? I just don't know enough, but this is just the conceptual methodological issue that I wish to raise. If we get to the a modern period, and so that's true of the medieval period as well, perhaps even of the British period. There must have been all kinds of British civil servants or even Indians serving in British times who were writing notes and concept papers that we still may not have unearthed. If we want to get a fuller picture, I mean, why is Curzon really the only figure that we've now brought forth into the modern period? There were other great governors general, great in the sense that they were very powerful, whether we agree with British rule or not. They were powerful and they had consequences. Their policies had consequences. Wellesley and people like that. But let's come to the modern period. Have we even begun to map the modern period in all its richness? I've been working with Siddharth Malavarappu, a former student of mine, now a professor at Shiv Nada University, on several volumes trying to reprint the writings of even the modern greats. Gandhi, Nehru, Aurobindo, Tagore, Savarkar, Golwalkar, these kinds of thinkers of the 20th century, and many others. I mean, I don't restrict it to them. In a volume we did recently, we brought even Annie Besant and Sister Nivedita, two foreigners who became Indian and lived the rest of their lives pretty much in India and died here. Who thought deeply about particularly Hindu thought. But we are very aware that those are just the ones that we very well know. Gokhale and other people like that as well. Of course, Vivekananda. Rahul Sagar at NYU is going to shortly publish a volume which goes much beyond that. He's recovered people from all over India. But they're only those who wrote in English. What about those who wrote in regional languages? He has a massive website called Ideas of India, where he's included links and references to people who wrote in regional languages as well. So there's a huge archive that is forming, but we have hardly begun to tap the modern writings. By modern, I mean from about the late 19th century, beginning with, let's say, Vivekananda. But one could actually go back further. Why not go back to Raja Ram Mohan Roy, for instance, who was really the beginnings of, let's say, modern Indian Renaissance thinking. Anyway, so that's the first problem, the modern, recovering the modern archive. The second is how to rank these works. Who's the most important and consequential? To translate it into the language of technology, what is the noise in the system? I mean, there may be hundreds of people who wrote, and what is the signal? What is the signal to noise ratio? What are the important people, or are they just the 7 or 8 greats that I mentioned of the nationalist movement and of that period that we traditionally recognize? So that's a second problem. The third is that, I mean, I suppose it's a linked issue, but at least if you go back to the ancient and medieval period, we can sort out some of the canonical texts fairly clearly. As I said, the great Hindu epics and now maybe Arthashastra and so on. But in modern times, who is canonical? especially post-independence India. Leave aside the Gandhis, the Nehrus, the Savarkars, the Golwalkars, the Aurobindos and Tagore's. But who is canonical after 1947? Nehru? Well, I mean, he was prime minister for 17 years. He wrote and spoke voluminously. After that, who? Patel died very soon. I've looked at a lot of his writings. They're not mostly on foreign affairs, except for that famous note on China. But who then? A name that leapt out as I prepared my notes was K. Subramaniam. His writings are massive. Arguably, he was very influential. He was around for a very, very long time. But is that it? Nehru and then K. Subramaniam and maybe 2 or 3 others here and there. Indira Gandhi through her speeches and so on. We don't have a good mapping of it. In my 2002 paper, which says there are 3 Indian schools of strategic thought, I resorted just to looking at think tankers, Indian academics, and I assembled a kind of collage. Because even amongst the Brahmachalanis and the Kannards and the Rajamohans and so on, K. Subramaniams, etc., Shekhar Guptas and Sanjay Barus and so on, these are the kinds of people whose writings I turned to typify these different schools. I mean, they hadn't written one single big book or 2 single big books that were so canonical, so well known, that really laid out all their ideas so clearly. So I had to take bits and pieces of their writings to produce a kind of what I call collage, to try and assemble something like, and I think if Johnson read my piece, he would be like, oh my God, what is this? This won't do. There's no central canonical text here. India doesn't have a strategic culture. Well, I beg to disagree, but that's one way of doing it. But, people might say, why only those 8 or 10 scholars, thinkers that you turn to? Why not A.P. Rana? Why not Shishir Gupta? Why not some politician and thinker, etc., etc.? Why not the speeches of Indira Gandhi and Narasimha Rao and Vajpai? And I am doing that now with Siddharth Mallavarapu. We're trying to take all the great speeches of prime ministers, foreign ministers, and others right up to Mr. Modi to produce a larger body of work. Okay, so having said that, what is, I think, fair to say is that we have come to a point where there's fair amount of agreement, and I'm qualifying this by saying fair amount. Probably, I think we can agree about 4 or 5 grand strategic schools that a lot of people now sort of accept. One is a kind of realist school, going back to the ancient period, the Kautilyas and all of that, or more modern realist thinkers, Subramaniam, let's say, or Bharat Karnar, or Achalani, or those kinds of figures, and of course some military thinkers in modern India. And then there's the geopolitical thinkers, particularly Panikkar. To some extent, I would say Raja Mohan, who's been writing on the Indian Ocean, the importance of the maritime part of Indian grand strategy. And of course, Curzon, right? So there's a realist band of strategic thought. Then, no escape from it, there's Nehruvianism, which is a school that I identified. Now, Nehruvianism is not the same as Nehru. There were Nehruvians after Nehru. And I would say Indira Gandhi is some kind of a Nehruvian, although some would say she's more of a realist. I would say Narasimha Rao in some ways is a Nehruvian, even Vajpai, although they're not Nehru. So there are many different people who fit into Nehruvianism, not just Nehru. Yeah. So that's a second school. I think broadly people would agree that something like Nehruvianism, non-alignmentism is a school of thought. The third is what I call neoliberal globalist, but might broadly just be called liberal economistic school. A group of thinkers who think that the economic tools a country has, the fact of economic interdependence in a globalized world, in a world where one talks the language of comparative advantage and so on, that you can deal with other countries and they deal with you on the basis of kind of liberal, of economic tools and instruments, and that's what you have to really look at. That's the leading edge of grand strategy, and that India should and has, to some extent, followed those kinds of ideas. And the fourth school is broadly, either you could call it Hindutva, you could call it Hindu nationalist. That's a fourth school of thought, which derives from the writings of, Savarkar, Golwalkar, perhaps Vivekananda to some extent, although I would hesitate somewhat there, and some others. That takes the view of to some extent, it's closer to the realist school, where concepts of the use of violence, of force, of building comprehensive national power based on fundamental kind of national unity, which rests on the unity of the Hindu community and giving expression to Hinduness in India's politics. That's somehow that will generate symbolic and political power. And you can, if you read Rahul Sagar's piece, Jiski Lathi Uski Bhains, that's a kind of depiction he has of the Hindu nationalist point of view. Okay, so most people would agree there are kind of these 4 or 5 grand strategy cultures that we have. There may be others. In another piece that I wrote later, I expanded it to thinking about, beyond these 4, to thinking about a Gandhian strategic culture and a Marxist strategic culture in India, but I won't dwell on those. Now to the question, and this is where I want to end up. I see my time is going. How does strategic culture drive grand strategy? And it's difficult to link them, in fact. That's the problem. How do ideas, which is strategic culture and strategic thinking, relate to practice and policy? There are several difficulties here as well in linking ideas to practice. First of all, how do ancient, medieval, or colonial writings, which are quite a bit in the past now, how do they link to present thought and present practice? Do we, as pointed out earlier in my lecture, know enough about the ancient past? Do policymakers, more importantly, think about those principles, ideas, precepts going back to ancient times? I mean, put it crudely, do they really know their Kautilya? Do they know their Ramayana, Mahabharata, whatever it is? Do they know medieval, Mughal grand strategy and the ideas of the time? Have they even read their Curzon? So, if one can't say that they know those, then how can one say that, those translated into policy? So kind of a big problem. Now, it can be saved in one way by saying, yeah, but think about the Carl Jung's idea, the famous German psychologist. There's something like a collective unconscious that we have in our mind, all kinds of ideas and imagery and symbols that have been handed down to us from a time in our lives when we were scarcely conscious. From our mothers, our fathers, our schools, our grandparents, the stories they told of the great epics and so on and so forth. And that, everyone knows something about the Mahabharata stories, the Ramayana, a bit of the Gita and other epics and so on in our past. And those are just there, like with mother's milk. We just have them and we know them. And so policymakers likewise, when they grew up, have those values and principles, even if they haven't read their Arthashastra very closely. So that's one response. So, I still think there's a kind of a methodological problem there. The second problem is how to trace through from ideas to decision making in government to actual implementation as grand strategy. I mean, in your personal life, you may have all kinds of ideas. You may sit around with your family and friends and teachers, enter into all kinds of discussions to make certain kinds of decisions. What movie shall we see? What city shall we live in? What subject should I study? What career should I opt for? But then your actual implementation is something else. So in political science, we talk about process tracing, which is to take a very careful empirical stock, tracing through an outcome, tracing it back all the way to its origins and showing all the steps along the way of how a bunch of ideas or interests or aims and objectives translated into behavior and certain kinds of outcomes. And no one has been able to do that for the link between strategic culture and grand strategy in India. Nobody, to my mind, has traced through a set of ideas, which is strategic culture, to showing that they showed up in decision-making discussions in the government and then were actually the basis for the policies that occurred. So that's another very big problem. The next problem is that there's no very clear mapping of grand strategy. If strategic culture explains grand strategic choices, I mean, you've got to have a picture, as it were, of the dependent variable, which is grand strategy, right? So what has India's grand strategy actually been? How has it varied? If it has varied over time, how does strategic culture explain the shift? Logically, there should be, if there's a shift in strategic culture, it should lead to a shift in grand strategic practice. But strategic culture is supposed to be something that's very enduring, that lasts over, I don't know, perhaps hundreds of years maybe. That's why it's called strategic culture, because it's so deeply embedded and continuous that we give it this idea that it's like culture. But if it's so enduring and unchanging, then how does it explain a grand strategy shift that may occur? And further, practice may affect strategic culture. So earlier I was saying the Johnsonian problem was that you don't want to learn about or abstract culture from practice. But there's another problem, which is that the actual practice, the actual policies of your government and other governments may cause a change in the world. It may alter the world as you act in the world. And strategic culture may gradually change as a result. After all, your thinking in a changed world will begin to alter. So practice may change the context within which strategic culture exists and may gradually change. So I think this mapping of strategic culture to grand strategy becomes very tricky. Okay, so I think, here I'll end. My own work illustrates some of these challenges. I mean, I've gone from thinking about 3 schools of nuclear thinking to 3 schools of grand strategic thinking to 6 schools of grand strategic thinking. Now I've come back to 3 schools of realism. And at best, what I can do is circumstantially show that they're linked to actual policies that the government is producing. And somebody asked me in another session, what is Modi's grand strategy? And in a rambling reply that I gave the person, I said, well, if you see the first couple of years of his prime ministership, he kind of looks like a Nehruvian reaching out to China and Pakistan, landing in Lahore on, Nawaz Sharif's birthday to chat with him, and trying to get talks going between the national security advisors and the foreign ministers. And then suddenly he becomes hard-nosed and looks more like a hyper-realist, and there's surgical strikes, and he cancels all talks until terrorism has been done away with. So now suddenly has he become a hyper-realist? Or was he always a hyper-realist and was hiding it? Other times, especially in dealing with China and to some extent with America, he emphasizes, economic ties. And he, in his first meeting with Xi Jinping in Gandhinagar, the 2 sides agreed that China would invest all this money in India, and there was great celebration. People thought that, trade and investment and economic interdependence would come to define the India-China relationship under Modi, and that perhaps out of that, we would finally get accommodation and even a border settlement. But even as he was on the Jhula with Xi Jinping, there was the episode in Chumar. The next year, there was Birdsea, the confrontation there. 2017, there was, Doklam, and of course, last year, 2020, there was Galwan. So what happened? In between, Mr. Modi met in 2 informal summits. So this is not a critique of Modi. This is how do we apply these different strategic culture schools to Mr. Modi's policies and the correlation between them? His policies seem to vary so much in this period, as did other prime ministers. It becomes a problem for strategic culture studies, it seems to me. So finally, shall we give up strategic culture studies then and to correlate to practice? I would say that's going too far. And there are the uses of strategic culture studies. They give us insights, first of all, into the range of policies that exist in a country. If here's the bag of tricks that India may have, here are these different schools of thought, they would tell us that there are different tendencies in terms of what policies India might form. So it gives you a window into possibly into Indian policy. Of course, it gives you an insight into thinking of other societies. You can read about the strategic culture of others, but here we're dealing with Indian strategic culture studies. It enhances critical thinking. When you look at these schools of thought, there are some very basic theoretical conceptual issues there. Realists, have an insistence on certain kinds of logics and arguments. So when we encounter Indian realists, we should bring to bear, it forces us to think about the assumptions that Indian thinkers are assuming. Do balances of power actually work? Does force solve a problem? What kind of logics are set in motion by the assumption that realists have of anarchy, or is anarchy what states make of it? So likewise, when liberals talk about how economics can bring countries together and generate power, is that right? Has interdependence stopped conflict? So I think looking at these strategic schools tends to force us to examine some basic assumptions and logics of thinking. Thirdly, I would say, what strategic culture studies, which Johnson pointed out, is that everything is not driven by anarchy. Realists say that because there's no central authority in international affairs, it's an anarchical domain. There's no higher authority that we obey. There are only sovereign nation states who have to negotiate amongst themselves. He says, realists say that what states do is driven by the structural principle of anarchy. So everyone responds to anarchy, and it drives you towards balance of power, deterrence, the use of force, relative power. But what Johnson showed is that the Chinese, ancient Chinese, were realist. They depended on military force and were not shy of using it. But that tradition comes out of their history, their cultural identity, their geography. He didn't say geography, but I just threw that in. But so it didn't come out of the assumption of anarchy. It came out of Chinese history due to local contextual factors. So it tells you that anarchy is not everything in international life. Countries make choices not driven by the logic of anarchy, but by the logic of identity, the logic of what Cohen has called the logic of appropriateness. What is correct behavior? And lastly, I think strategic culture studies enhances our understanding of IR. Of particularly this idea that Amitav Acharya, Barry Buzan, and others are talking about of global IR. And they're saying, let's not get stuck only on the Western contributions to IR. There may be contributions by non-Westerners, Latin Americans, Africans, Asians. What about them? And I think if you start to look at strategic culture, that's one way of going towards a global IR. Because every country has strategic thinkers. They may not all have IR theorists, but they all have strategic thinkers. And so it's a place where you could begin to do global IR, it seems to me, a more pluralistic discipline. What's the future of strategic culture studies in India? I think I'll just stop there. I can answer that question in Q&A. I've spoken much longer than I wanted. And so I look forward to your questions. And thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I think that was prolific and our entry into the whole panoramic idea of strategic culture to the critique of the neo-realist looking only the paradigm of anarchy and the exemplary contributions, not just by the ancient thinkers and those of them who have added to our strategic thinking and culture as well, but also the modern thinkers since 1940s to 1950s. And then subsequently till your time, and even many of the youngsters whom you mentioned, including Rahul Saga, I think that's one of the things that probably we need to look at the non-Western IR and the type of contributions that are coming in. I think it's slowly developing. It's an area that students are finding more interesting. That's why you see students in India that coming into international relations, foreign policy, or
or geopolitics, and also there are a number of think tanks that have come up in India. I think it's picked up in a big way. We hope that it takes greater roots, and we'll be able to be part of that body of knowledge. Thank you, sir. Now I'll open the session for Q&A, and we will have, let's say, around 25 minutes with Professor Bajpai. He needs to catch up with other things as well. So make your questions pointed, no comments as such, but questions, precise questions specific to the talk that he has delivered today, and rest we can keep it for later. I'm sure he'll be more than happy to interact with us. Now, the floor is open for all of you to have a question. I think Professor Raju wants to open. Professor Raju.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, sir, for giving an overview of strategic culture in India. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I have two questions. One is you mentioned about Professor Cohen has given four schools of strategic cultures in India. I think I missed it. I do not know what are the four schools of strategic cultures given by Professor Stephen Cohen. And the second point is, what is your view on status of international studies in India? Thank you, sir.
Yeah. I think Cohen's four schools were roughly, the ones I mentioned: a realist school, Nehruvian school, a Hindu nationalist school, and a kind of economistic type of school. He had slightly different names for them. My names were slightly different, but we were writing at about the same time. In fact, he knew my work. So, we were influencing each other at about the same time. Although we came to those schools independently, but then we discovered that we were talking the same. Yes. I happened to be in the Brookings Institution with him at that time. So I think, it was basically the same four. But you can look it up in his book, India, Emerging Power. There's a chapter there on it. As for the state of international studies, I think that's an interesting question. You can see now that there are different tendencies, and I think it's all to the good. Indian IR is beginning to take off. So one mainstream is kind of what I call problem solving, which is, what kinds of policies has India followed and should it follow? That's kind of strategic studies of a kind, Professor A.P. Rana in Baroda, who long looked at these issues, used to call them kind of relational studies, India's policy towards Pakistan, China, and so on and so forth. Not very theorized, some sort of vague realism informing it. And so that's probably what most Indian IR scholars do most of the time, and that's perfectly understandable. It's an important body of work. I think it could be more conceptual, theoretical, but at any rate, that's what the mainstream is probably about. The second is, and I include in that studies of international organizations and so on, and multilateralism and that whole set of studies. The second, I think, is there is a growing attention to issues of theory and theorization. That is, it's a minor stream, but it's there, and you can see it among some thinkers in JNU, Yadavpur, I'm sure down in Pondicherry. I know some in Kerala at Mahatma Gandhi University as well, in Delhi University. And so, forgive me if I left some out, but in the new private universities, especially Ashoka and Shiv Nadar. So I think there's a substratum of people who, like everywhere, are more interested in conceptual, theoretical, and to some extent methodological issues, although I don't think we're doing much on the methodology front in India. So that's a second stream of work. A third stream, I would say, is work that has really begun under the leadership of Srinath Raghavan, Itty Abraham, of a slightly older generation who came before Srinath, really insisting on going to archival material in Indian foreign policy. So looking at whatever archives they can lay their hands on. And the archives are beginning to open up. The National Archives, memoirs, papers donated to the Teen Murthy House, such as the Menon papers and so on and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of people, Rudra Chaudhary, Pallavi Raghavan at Ashoka. And there are scholars in Britain, Indian scholars of Indian origin, or Western scholars looking at India, who are beginning to reconstruct the narrative we have of Indian foreign policy going back to 1949 really by looking through these papers now. And I think that's been a very, very exciting turn, very good writing there as well, very elegant, strong writing, really depending on solid empirics to give us a different view of what's going on. Then there's a fourth stream is area studies. So JNU would be probably the heart of that. So that's not always concerned with India's policies towards, but it's the study of different regions and countries for their own sake. Well, of course, I mean, with an eye to India's interests and so on, but people might be studying Latin America or North America or Southeast Asia and so on. So there's some tradition of area studies. I don't think it's ever delivered what was hoped, particularly an interdisciplinary kind of appreciation of the politics, government, political economy, strategies, domestic politics of other regions, partly because of limitations of fieldwork funding, for instance, or language limitations. Students not taking the trouble to learn Chinese or Korean or Spanish or Arabic or whatever. If you can't really be an area studies scholar, to be honest. And I think, you know, Indian area studies has not therefore really made much of a mark globally speaking. You don't see many citations of Indian works on in any area studies works. And then I think, you know, I would say those are kind of the 4 or 5 big areas of international studies in India. One last area which I would put probably slightly apart from these is the kind of work I've been talking about today. Strategic thought, international thought. So international thought, I would say, is about the idea of international order. It's not focused on India and its interests and so on. It's more cosmopolitan branch of thinking. You know, when Immanuel Kant talks about a perpetual peace, I mean, he's talking about ideas that would inform anyone thinking about the need for a better world and how it can be achieved. And I think there is international thought in India. People thinking about bigger moral, ethical questions about how the world should be organized. And Siddharth Malhotra and I have tried to bring out works in India that speak to those kinds of concerns. All of which, you know, suggest that one area to move or to use increasingly and mine in strategic culture studies is comparative political theory, you know, which deals with these kinds of issues as well, and intellectual history. So I think there's something beginning to emerge there of sort of strategic culture studies, international thought, comparative political theory, normative theory, some work in India that speaks to that, but not a lot. So let me just stop there.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I have my colleague, Dr. Anand. His PhD has been on China strategic culture.
Yeah.
It's been quite a great work that he's planning to publish now.
Right.
Dr. Anand, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Kanti Bajpai, for giving us a very informative discourse on strategic culture. I think you basically covered some of the most important parts of the debate on strategic culture, which I have also been studying about. Now, I just wanted to get your views on a few issues. One is regarding the perhaps I think this came the second wave of the strategic culture studies on viewing strategic culture as something which is instrumental in nature. What is your take on that? Is strategic culture simply a matter of deception in a world of real politics? That is one. The second one is about the dynamic nature of strategic culture. Will strategic culture obviously has diversity, but when it comes to its dynamics, will it actually die away with time, in the sense that will a particular strain or a strand of strategic culture die away with time? The case I would like to bring here is about Japan and Germany. I mean, pre and post 45, their trajectories are kind of totally different. That is the second one. Third is about Indian strategic culture from a perspective of from an alternative perspective. Here, the one example which I would like to bring to your notice is that of the Cholas. who were instrumental in, as you know, in Singapore as well as in East and Southeast Asia, projecting India's influence and power over there. What were they fired up with? What was their strategic culture about? Was it linked to Mahabharata, or was it linked to something like Tirukural or something which we are not much aware of? And the last one is about, it's a very ironical situation. Kautilya, where he taught about all the strategy, the university is today located in Pakistan, right? So does in Pakistan, do they have any kind of a study, or do they have some acknowledgement, or at least in some way do they look upon some of these historical influences?
Yeah.
How do they view Kautilya?
Yeah.
Do they accept it?
Right. Let me go.
So these are some of the questions.
Yeah. Let me answer the questions backwards in reverse order. So the first one, I've seen one reference somewhere, but I can't recall where, to a Pakistani saying that exactly what you said, which is that he probably lived and thought for a good bit of time in what is present-day Pakistan, and his insights are quite valid for anyone, regardless of the fact that he was a Hindu or whatever. We in Pakistan should recover that thought, own it, and use it. Indeed, we may have used it better than India. Something like that I remember reading. Now, I just can't remember where I read it, but you might be able to Google it by going Kautilya in Pakistan or some such thing, So that's my answer. That's all I know on that subject. But I'm sure that Pakistani strategic thinkers will have done what academies do everywhere, which is they would have studied Kautilya and seen whether it informs Indian strategic thought and whether it helps them understand India's moves and counter moves. So you can be very sure that their military, parts of their military, are quite familiar with the Arthashastra. I'm willing to put money on that. Second, about the Cholas, I don't know. The other day I was giving a talk on my book, India versus China, and I was saying that probably the only instance of kind of Indian imperialism outside of South Asia, that is, might be the Cholas operating in Southeast Asia. Unlike the Chinese, who have a history of via the tributary system of a kind of imperialism, if you like. And of course, we know the West has a tradition of massive imperialism that was global. But India does not seem to have a tradition of imperialism, except that if you allow imperialism to be conquests outside of what we now know as South Asia. Of course, there was all kinds of fighting and so on, and imperial kingdoms and structures within what is now South Asia. But we never really ventured outside of what is South Asia, except for the Cholas. I don't know enough about that history, excuse me, to say why they went. But I think they went really in search of trying to monopolize certain parts of the trade in the Malacca area, which was a very vibrant area, and to collect tribute as well. And when they felt disrespected. So in that sense, they weren't perhaps so different from various Chinese dynasties that sought tribute from right up to the time of Cheng He, particularly the admiral, who came into the Indian Ocean and so on. So there may be a Chola tributary system, for at least very briefly, that might have existed. I'm not sure whether at the conceptual ideational level, they were driven by, either Indian Hindu epics or by, local thinkers who had great standing. I didn't catch the name of the person you mentioned, but one can imagine that might be the case. And that's one of the problems for Indian strategic culture studies, is that we don't know enough about great thinking and great epics and stories outside of, the Mahabharata and so on. So I can't say enough, can't say very much about that. On the issue of the dynamism of strategic culture, I mean, as I was saying, the whole kind of attraction to strategic culture is that it is enduring and has a long lifespan. And because it does, it therefore gives you a clue to what a country might do. Because it's so deeply embedded and enduring, one can count on it being consequential, having impact. But as you point out, I mean, Japan before World War, after the Second World War, seemingly has dispensed with that strategic culture of the 1920s and 30s and earlier. And what brought it about? Well, total strategic defeat. And in a piece that you may have read, since you do Chinese strategic culture issues, is the piece by, I think it's by Andrea Giselli, who's I think Italian scholar living and working in China, who has tried to update Alistair Ian Johnson's work. And he says that one way that strategic culture, of course, changes is through strategic defeat. So that's one factor that would bring change to strategic thinking and strategic culture. Of course, strategic thinking and strategic culture are not exactly the same thing, although I've been using those two terms interchangeably. When we say strategic thinking, we can allow for pluralism, different schools of strategic thinking. I think the idea of strategic culture is not so accommodative of pluralism. When Johnson and others talk about a strategic culture, they insist upon a dominant school at the very least. And they don't bother about the other contending schools, minor schools. So one way that strategic culture, which is the enduring dominant, might change is when these other minor streams of thought begin to gain intellectual traction and begin to compete and even then win the intellectual competition. And maybe you're seeing something like that in India, where Nehruvianism, which dominated for 30, 40 years, was gradually kind of pushed away from its position of primacy by what I call neoliberal thinking, and now maybe gradually under the pressure of events and internal political change within India with the rise of Mr. Modi, and before that the rise of the BJP, a more conservative strand in India, which looks more to something like realism, which is more comfortable with the application of force, more comfortable with India as a power that throws its weight around and uses its power. So one can see that these alternative schools were there, but they weren't dominant and they weren't the strategic culture of India. But the pressure of events, of political change, and India's own rise. I mean, you can think more like a realist when you are very powerful. When you're weak, somebody said that, I think Bharat Karnad said years ago, that it's understandable that Nehru insisted on non-alignment and negotiation because India was weak and it couldn't throw its weight around. But as you become more powerful, you could imagine a different kind of strategic set of choices and strategic thought. So yeah, I mean, I think strategic culture is dynamic in that sense. It responds to events, political change internally, new intellectual strands that come to the fore. But yeah, tracing it through and pinning down why change occurs is the job of intellectual history. And that's why I was saying that Indian strategic culture studies will have to move towards a whole tradition in political science and history of intellectual history, which addresses this issue of how bodies of thought change and why they change and when they change. I don't think you'll get much help from mainstream political science in answering that question. And your first question, I've kind of lost. I've forgotten. But
the instrumentality.
Yeah, well, I don't know quite what you mean by that. I mean, the second wave of strategic culture studies I understood to be, this trying to abstract strategic culture from practice. I mean, that's how Johnson typified the second wave. He said, these guys who looked at the Soviet Union looked at their behavior and then tried to pull out some patterns of behavior and then said, oh, okay, that now tells us what their basic principles of operation are. And he said that's wrong because it becomes tautological. You abstract the principles from behavior and then you use the principles that you got from behavior to explain behavior. So you're into a circular loop. So it doesn't work. So if that's what you mean by instrumentality, that you abstract these principles and then you use these principles to predict what your adversary might do or what, and so on, then yeah, I mean, there is that strand, but I guess I buy the Johnsonian argument that the second wave work methodologically simply gets us into a a circular loop and is limited in its helpfulness. I mean, it may describe a lot about what practice is, but it doesn't tell you what strategic culture may be. And so that's a problem. And so I would say I would still prefer Johnson's answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think the scholar you mentioned is Saif Tahir, who has written about why Pakistan is not using Kautilyan's strategic culture or Kautilyan thought itself. Moving on to Ms. Malavika, we can probably have maybe 2 questions. Malavika?
Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
That was a very enlightening lecture, sir. I actually have 2 questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
My first question is about new wave perspectives, environmental feminist perspectives as such. What kind of influence have they had on India's strategic culture? That's my first question. And my second question is that is it possible that integration was delayed for India for a very long time, and so it's happening now as current events unfold?
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of, ecofeminism, which I don't know very well, but I have a sense of what it is. Indeed, feminist thought, other streams of critical thinking. I think, clearly those are all very important, and they have enriched every subfield of political science, including IR. There's no doubt about it. I mean, just take, say, some of the kind of feminist security studies work by Cynthia Enlow, or the famous piece by, by the political psychologist, gosh, the name's just gone straight out of my head, who wrote about, nuclear speak amongst American strategists, the very famous piece. I mean, and there are many others, obviously, but I just cite 2 very important instances, early instances. I mean, these works brought a kind of critical perspective that deconstructed many of the very important kind of leading ideas of standard IR. I think where all that work has kind of had an impact on this field of kind of strategic culture studies and so on. I don't know if you know the work of Bradley Klein, for instance, who in the 1990s, took a critical perspective on strategic culture studies to really talk about, kind of problems of militarization in American strategic culture and all of that, So, I mean, what he did suggest, as others have, is that, from a critical perspective, strategic culture studies can give us a way into examining some well-worn assumptions and blowing them up and showing what lies behind them. That what lies behind them might be very, maybe a kind of language games and practices that are politically discriminatory, that are politically, imperialistic, if I could use that word, that are patriarchal, and therefore that, the whole field of security studies, strategic culture studies, and so on, has to wrestle with the problem of the kind of language, the terminologies, the assumptions that they make about how that is either marginalizing certain kinds of lines of thinking, how it's marginalizing communities and groups, how it is arrogating security studies and thinking about security for a society, pushing it in a certain direction and ignoring more emancipatory possibilities. So I think that there is that possibility. I think, though, that on the whole, the two haven't met very much. That critical studies very broadly, whether it's from ecological perspectives or feminist perspectives or hybrids or Marxist perspectives or other forms of critical studies, they haven't kind of penetrated strategic culture studies enough, and that they seem to stay away from each other. The one bridge that has happened is, I suppose, constructivism, which is that especially with Peter Katzenstein's edited volume, The Culture of National Security, that opened up some space in a gentle way, I think, towards these more critical perspectives on security and things like strategic culture, about how we, through concepts of identity and so on, that those inform how we think about security and security instruments. That it's not just, as I was saying earlier, that the logic of anarchy is what drives India to do this or that, but it's the play of identity, of ideas, of norms, that these drive what we do and what we don't do, how we think, and lines of thinking that we ignore. So thanks for that question, because I think that when I said earlier in the talk that strategic culture studies are important because they kind of push us towards interrogating security thinking and the basic assumptions that lie behind some of the assertions that are made in strategic thought. I think, that was kind of what I was pushing towards, which is that strategic culture studies can kind of really open up the whole field of strategy and of indeed of IR, the study of IR in India, which is generally quite conventional, realist sort of inclined, as I indicated in my answer to Subramaniam Raju. The space for critical studies in India of IR is actually still very small. So it's ironic that, I mean, how many Indian IR people do post-colonial IR, for instance? That's really a branch of IR that is, if it's to be found anywhere, it's to be found in the West and Australia, not in India. We're still doing pretty conventional IR. So I think strategic culture studies at least take us in the direction of paying more attention to our own situation in our part of the world, digging back into our history, our geography, our culture, our sense of identity, without becoming essentialist. I mean, I would not want to now claim some nativist Indian thought that has never been influenced by anyone, that is, and I certainly wouldn't want to claim that Indian thought is better than Chinese thought, or Chinese thought is better than Muslim thought, or we're all better than Western thinkers. I mean, I'm not into that game, and I don't think that's the way to go. But there are resources in our history and culture, and we should explore those. By the way, that's a service to the world. I mean, there may be ways that we've thought about things that would be good for everyone in the world, not just for us in India. And your second question, since I gave such a long answer to the first one, I've forgotten completely.
Sir, it was about an integrated perspective or an integrating strategic culture. Is it possible that because integration itself was delayed for India, that it's happening as current events unfold?
Yeah, I don't know quite where you're going with that. I don't see more integration now at one level than before. I mean, there are people arguing in India that we are less integrated today than we were 30 years ago. That there are all kinds of rifts and divisions and questions opening up, so that we're less integrated. Now, that's getting us into the political. Have the last 8 or 10 years under, the BJP caused less integration or more? Was Nehru divisive, or was he more integrationist? I don't know. I think it's an open question. I mean, I would probably vote for we were more integrated earlier and less integrated today, but I mean, I know tens of millions of Indians think differently today. So I don't know. I don't think that strategic culture studies, reflect that. It may be that if there was a dominant personality or thinker in India, that would lead to, convergence on one school above all. One might say that when Nehru was so dominant, we had a convergence on Nehruvianism as the dominant school, even though at the height of his power, there were contending views from his own son-in-law, from other critics within his own party, from the Swatantra Party, which was an early exponent of what I call neoliberal globalist, sympathetic to relations with America, wanting to side with the West in the Cold War, and dependent on market forces for building India's economic progress, not on planning and Nehruvianism and so on. So, there were contendings. There was the Hindu right even then. But because Nehru and the Congress was so dominant, we got, I suppose, Nehruvianism dominant. Today, one might say that with the rise of Bajpai and then Modi, we've shifted ground to something more like a Hindu nationalist or realist perspective. I think Mr. Modi hasn't been long enough in power to really match Nehru's impact yet. And also he's dealing with a country that is far more now cognizant of foreign policy. There are many think tanks, there's the media, there are many university programs. The country is much bigger and more complex. He may never attain that kind of, position in India. And so there may never be such a dominant school of thinking as there was perhaps when Nehru was around. So I would say that's where I stand on that. And of course, I'm happy to be proven wrong.
Thank you, sir. I think on her question on the echo part of it and looking back at the history, I think Meera Bindu's work will be helpful to her to just locate from where this thought of being close to the nature has originated as part of the strategic culture as well. So that is a possibility. I think we'll move on to one last question, probably that will be by Ms. Rushita.
Yeah, just on that, before I get that question, I mean, I think it's true that if you look at, what you might call eco-feminist work or even just feminist work, I mean, even if you take the view of, say, just a standard kind of view of, of one stream of feminism, which invokes patriarchy, the binaries that are let loose by patriarchy certainly seem to suggest that one of those binaries, those binaries are male, let's say female, the personal and the public, the private and the public, but also, nature and nurture, the human and the natural, and so in all these binaries, we know that, if we do our deconstructive kind of thinking, that one pole in the binary is taken to be superior or is validated more. And one could say, from today's perspective of ecological crisis, that what we're facing is the fruits of having taken in the binary, the human constructed world and our ability to solve all problems through our human endeavor and human consumption and human progress in a material sense, that was how we were going to make our world and our life and produce security in the broadest sense of the term security. I don't mean national security, but human security, in everyday individual security for ourselves as a species. As against that, we thought we could control nature, and that. But I think, as Amitav Ghosh has shown in his recent works, nature can speak, and nature is speaking very clearly through its cyclones and extreme weather events and water scarcities, and then floods and barrages of water, the deluge of water in cloudbursts and other events. So we think speech is human, but if nature has its own symbolic system and warning systems, and so I think there's something there that's going on, that we have to pay attention to. And certainly, when I teach security studies here, I teach non-traditional security for 4 or 5 weeks as much as other things, because students are fascinated, and quite rightly, because their life chances depend on, this larger perspective of, say, climate change and a broader conception of security. So yeah, I mean, I think I would certainly leave that, and that does introduce the possibility of another school of strategic thinking that may grow in India and be very important, which is a kind of, larger grand strategy based on our adaptation to nature, not just our mastery over nature. Sorry, so back to the person who's going to ask me a question, but your question,
Rushita.
This question set off a train of thought.
Yeah, Rushita,
yeah,
please go ahead.
Sorry, Ruchita, sorry.
Yeah, hello, sir. Thank you so much for the riveting lecture. So my question to you is, when we talk about India's grand strategy, it often narrows down or restricts to Pakistan. Like, for example, even if today we deal with the Afghanistan crisis, there is a large section in India which believes that or looks at it from the looming threats from Pakistan. So do you think there is a need to stop limiting our grand strategy or our strategic culture to only looking at Pakistan and need to incorporate more diverse point of views?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it was probably true until a few years ago that Pakistan dominated, but now everything is China. I mean, yeah, there's been the momentary problem of Afghanistan and a swing back towards looking at, the fallout from Afghanistan. But I would still say the major preoccupation of our strategic community in the last 15 years or so has been China more than Pakistan, and certainly over the last 5 or 7 years. And when I wrote my book, India versus China, the publisher, stoked my interest and pushed me from that kind of understanding that China was now the main threat. Pakistan was kind of a has-been, and India had a way of dealing with Pakistan. We shouldn't devote too much time to it. I mean, you may be right that the Afghan problem will reinvigorate a concern with Pakistan. What is true as a result of Galwan is that it's come home to us that, something we haven't thought about enough, which is the two-front problem. And the two-front problem is both a conventional military problem, which is that we may have to fight both countries militarily simultaneously, but it's also a nuclear two-front problem, because if the fighting gets very bad and the situation gets uncontrollable, any one of these actors might be forced to think about the use of nuclear weapons. And that choice may come to India as well, especially if we're fighting a two-front war, which would be very difficult to combat at this juncture. The temptation to then use nuclear weapons to deal with one or threaten to deal with one opponent while using nuclear weapons while fighting conventionally with the other. I mean, you can imagine the complications that might arise from that situation. Who do you target first? Do you have enough weapons to target both? What would your opponents, who are both nuclear weapon states, think about in turn in terms of their nuclear responses? So I think these kinds of problems will give rise to more strategic thinking. And going back to that issue about how dynamic strategic thought and particularly strategic culture can be, it's not just defeat that might cause your strategic culture to change, as in Japan, but the prospect of defeat. In this case, in a two-front war, it's a very serious problem potentially. But yeah, I mean, I think there are other grand strategic problems. It's not just these two. For a very long time for India, the United States was almost as big a problem as any other country, because of the constraints they placed on our nuclear program, because of their collusion with Pakistan and China at various junctures, because of the difficulties they visited upon us in areas such as trade and so on. So when I wrote the original piece that I did in 2002 on Indian grand strategy, actually I looked at 5 areas: Pakistan, China, the United States, India's nuclear weapons policies, and its domestic security, managing diversity. So the original article looked at 5 challenges of India's security. And actually, I wrote an entire book, which I never published, looking at those 5 different areas. They're still in my computer, 350 pages of which I didn't publish, but that's another story for on why I didn't. But yeah, so I don't think it would be a very satisfactory grand strategy that only dealt with Pakistan. Of course, that would be very myopic and ineffective.
Sir, is there time for you to take one more question?
Yeah, just one last question. Yeah.
Okay, Pawan Agarwal, can we have your question, please?
Sure. Thank you, sir. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm really an outsider to strategic studies. I'm a biologist. I took copious notes throughout your talk, and I would be buying your books and reading them. I have a more broad question going back to your original topic of the talk, which is about, just 1 minute. So grand strategy and how it intertwines with a country's grand narrative. I mean, you did touch upon several of these during the Q&A as well as your talk. So you spoke about Jungian idea of collective unconscious, but somehow we default to this collective conscious in the moment of crisis. And you also spoke about this idea of Steve Cohen about identity driving a country to make decisions. So what about our grand narrative as a country? Should we even have a grand narrative? like Americans have their own grand narrative of founding fathers and American exceptionalism and so on, so that we go beyond this sort of myopic thinking. And if we should not have a grand narrative because it will exclude a certain group of people that you also briefly alluded to, so what are the opposite views that that are there?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is an important question. Some people, some scholars and thinkers just don't buy this idea of a grand narrative for a country, of a overarching kind of story it tells itself that everyone is mobilized by, inspired by, buys into, and all of that. So they say that there's always been several contending narratives about a country, and that's the best you can achieve. And actually that's good because it's a kind of check and balance, you know. They see that as a good in itself. Others think that if you don't have a grand narrative, you know, that is widely accepted, if not completely accepted, then you know, you can't come together as a society, you can't build power, you can't deal with enemies outside, and you might even be vulnerable inside. And so this is, I think that's where we are today in India almost. We had a grand narrative, let us say, of a kind of Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi type. And then one might say that it began to break up into several grand narratives. And then one might say today that with the rise of the BJP, there's an attempt to bring another grand narrative to bear, you know, and a different set of stories about what India has been, what it is, what it could be. And so you have sort of cycles where there's a unified grand narrative that is sought and that might come to dominate, and there are other times when there are several contending ones. So I don't know. I mean, I think again, these are issues that sometimes are almost personal, that we all have to think about for ourselves. Of course, they're being debated in the mainstream too, collectively. Is it better to have a singular grand narrative and identity or a broader one? I mean, I think that at any given time, of course, India has something of a story that everybody buys into, you know. Then within that, there are variations. So I think there's wide acceptance that of a narrative that says it's good that we got rid of the colonial powers, whatever good they may have done, but we didn't want a foreign people ruling us. Whether you're left, right, or center in India, I think everyone has agreed on that. Everyone's agreed more or less now, deep in their hearts, that, like it or not, partition was probably a good thing, you know. And some are more okay with that, and some people are less okay with that. But anyway, existentially, that's what it is. And I don't think as part of our narrative anymore, there's this idea of really of Akhand Bharat, even amongst the right, that we want to go back and reunify and bring back Bangladesh, Pakistan into India. We don't tell our story that way anymore. I think across the spectrum. I think across the spectrum, everyone thinks that India should be a great power or a big power and have a kind of global role. What power is varies. I think for Nehruvians, thinking about India as a great power would be a great moral, intellectual, normative force for good. That's how India would sit at the highest table, not necessarily as an economic and military power. But others would emphasize more traditional views, which is, you know, you can't really be on the high table unless you're a great military power. So your narrative has to be to become a great military power. But I think so, whatever it is, some would tell a more leftist story about India being, you know, in the vanguard of kind of a human emancipation, and it's a power bit that leads, in a sense, global revolution, not violently, but through its various policies and actions for disenfranchised and disempowered people all over the world. So I think what varies is what constitutes power, but all Indian groups, I think, are agreed that India somehow has a special place in the chancelleries of decision making, as Nehru put it, you know, that India would be a force given its civilization, its size, its population, its other strengths, that it would count and must count. And I think that's part of a story that everyone can accept in India. I think there is a story about diversity in India, that there is a kind of acceptance of diversity across the spectrum, but how to deal with certain aspects of that diversity is where things get divided. But there is a narrative that somehow diversity is a deep principle in India, and that on the whole, it's one that we're likely to have for a long, long time. I mean, we're not going to all become this religion or that caste or this language group or anything else. So there's that, what Kant called, the fatal diversity of human beings. Fatal meaning, inescapable, not fatal in terms of you die. So I think there is a grand narrative there that everyone can buy into. But from time to time, we tell ourselves we don't have a grand narrative and we don't recognize it because there's a lot of polarization at a very superficial political level that we're encountering today. But there is a grand narrative there, I think, still. And I think it would be an interesting job to try and build on that. What is the grand narrative we can buy into? Now, not all of that grand narrative may be progressive. I mean, there may be parts of that grand narrative that are not so grand in a moral sense. And that too has to be pointed out. Going back to the question about feminism, an ecological perspective on security and our relationship to nature. I mean, there's probably a grand narrative in India which is not very emancipatory there, which we're all pretty much agreed on, but we don't interrogate enough. Let me leave it there, folks. I think I notice I have only 8
Brilliant, sir.
at my next meeting.
Yes, thank you. Thank you,
very
sir.
much,
I think exemptionally you dealt with all of them. Now we'll request my second year master students, Ms. Priyanka Jaiswal, to deliver a formal vote of thanks.
Your mic is muted.
Priyanka, unmute yourself.
I'm so sorry, sir, for that. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege for me to present a formal vote of thanks to Professor Kanti Bajpai, sir. On behalf of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, sir, I'd like to thank you for taking out time and engaging with us and enlightening us on this very important topic, which is on the discourse of India's strategic culture and grand strategy. So I'd like to say this, before the beginning of this lecture, I had a very narrow view, mainly the George Stanham view that India does not have a rich strategic culture. But now, since you've given us so many points, giving, very great historical background to the beginning of Indian strategic cultural studies and the concept of grand strategy and strategic culture. Now we have many points to think upon, and your lecture today is definitely going to help us in future. Mostly the one important point that I liked is, though there are limitations in understanding how strategic culture is driving grand strategy, nevertheless, strategic studies are important because they can help us in explaining various exceptions that, the rationalist IR theories cannot explain. So thank you so much, sir. It was a very enriching and learning experience. I would also like to thank the head of the department, Dr. Nandakishore, sir, and all the other faculty members for making this webinar possible and coordinating it throughout. Last but not the least, I'd like to thank the audience, both from within and outside the department, for actively participating and asking some very relevant and pertinent questions and making this discussion a fruitful one. Thank you, sir, and we hope to have future interactions with you and hope to see everyone in the upcoming sessions too. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Professor Bajpai,
thanks a lot.
Yes, Professor Bajpai, it's also our humble request, when you're in India, please do let us know. If you can visit Manipal and the department, it will be really nice and to have you around. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Kind of you for having agreed to deliver this lecture.
All the best.
Thanks
a lot. Enjoyed it.
Bye. Thank you so much.